So the question which I want to raise is one that looks to Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and in many ways, if you ask people what its greatest achievements are, very typically what you're going to hear is the development of perspective. And if you then look at, okay, let's look at a history of painting and see what is that development of perspective. What you'll find is a hit list, a canon, if you will, of major images which have come down worthily through the ages. But what will typically happen is that survey will start in the 14th century, in the first half, seem to be going wonderfully progressively, and I use that term progressively with caution because we're going to undermine that, okay, and then hits 1348. Now, if you have a time machine, you do not want to go back to the 1340s in Europe because it is exactly that moment where, crop failures of the early 1340s and followed by bank failures of the early to mid 1340s, and they all breathe a sigh of relief and say, it can't go downhill from here. 1348, the Black Death, the Great Plague. And we're talking something that took populations by surprise in the summer of 1348, wiping out 20 to 70%, 20 to 80% of cities up and down the Italian peninsula and then up into Northern Europe as well. Most people studying the Renaissance will say, okay, there's a pause. And then in 1400, it starts again. And lo and behold, in 1400 comes the beginnings of perspective, which you can root back to the early 14th century, but it's in that 15th century that it comes to be. I want to argue something very differently. I want to argue that the Great Plague caused a major rethinking in society, a society which had been very strongly centered on how you know a subject or an entity is by itself. In other words, a city that is known by the families that lived in that city. And I want to suggest that in 1348, with the plague wiping out all of those citizens, what you have is a real need to rethink, to think anew. How do we mean a city? And lo and behold, it becomes a city that we would more be familiar with, a city with a map, a city by area, a city which is really the buildings that stood for those families rather than those families themselves. I want to argue then that perspective, which in itself is a theoretical construct, which creates sort of an empty stage space upon which then a painter populates his story. I want to suggest that had the plague not happened, the notion of telling stories in pictures would have stayed with those stories, with those characters, like being with those families. So what we're really looking at is a shift from the world, how we perceive it, versus the world and how we theorize it and start thinking of it abstractly. I'm suggesting then, had the plague not happened, then perspective as a construct in painting would not have happened. And you might say, perspective in the Renaissance, so what? Except for all of our image-based photography, video, all of those are 19th century fulfillments, technological fulfillments of this theory, which originates in 15th century Italy. And I'll stop there.